Frazzeldow's Horribly Dreadful Tales. The Sprite. Chapter 3. Retelling this story truly breaks my heart. No living being should have to endure what my little sprite went through in that mysterious castle. When my dear sprite awoke, it found itself in a cage in the room at the top of the spire. Looking around, the sprite saw the laughing fox sitting against a wall, staring at the sprite. "Please," the sprite begged. "Please, you must let me out of here." "Now why would I do that?" the laughing fox replied. Her voice sounded hollow but pleasant. "Please," the little sprite begged again. "Please, I must get out of here." "Oh, little sprite," the laughing fox said, "you're never leaving here." The little sprite just stared back in horror. "Oh, don't be so gloomy, little sprite. You can still have fun here. Just behave and play along. Now you be a good little sprite. You'll see, it's really not so bad," the laughing fox said as she slipped out the door. At this, the sprite began to weep. In an act of desperation, the little sprite let out a blast of magical energy at the cage door, but alas, it glanced off ineffectual. Perhaps if the cage had been made of wood or stone, the sprite might have had a chance of escaping, but the cage was metal, and the sprite's magic could not move it. To most sentient creatures, being put in a cage is a truly awful experience. But to a sprite so used to wandering the forest of its own accord, being caged was truly maddening. In a fit of claustrophobic panic, the sprite began bashing its body against the side of the cage. On and on it crashed into the cage until, exhausted, it fell to the floor, bruised and bloody. The sprite began to weep again until it passed out exhausted. When the sprite woke again, it saw the snarling demon sitting in a chair next to the cage, watching the sprite. "Well, aren't you a mess?" the snarling demon said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "We'll have to get you cleaned up before we can let you out of there." "Please," the little sprite said, "please just let me go." "Go?" the snarling demon said in mock confusion. "And where would you go, little sprite?" "Home," the little sprite said. "I want to go home, back to my forest." "Oh, but little sprite," the snarling demon replied, "don't you know? This is your home now." At that, the snarling demon walked over to his workbench and began tinkering at something. Curious, the little sprite tried to flutter up to see what it was, but as it neared the bars of the cage, Frederick put his paws up on the table next to it and began to growl. "Behave," the snarling demon said. The little sprite wasn't sure if he was talking to it or the dog. Regardless, it sat back down, and Frederick stopped growling. "Before I can let you out," the snarling demon said, walking back over to the cage, "you're going to need a mask." The snarling demon slipped the tiny mask that the sprite had seen him working on before into the cage. "I've never had to make a mask for a magical creature before," the snarling demon said. "Nonetheless, put it on, and I think you'll find the experience quite soothing." White-hot anger seethed inside of my little sprite, and it hurled the mask at the snarling demon. But when it reached the bars of the cage, it bounced off as if there were some kind of magical shield. "I will never wear that mask," the sprite said. "Well, I guess you'll have to get used to that cage then," the snarling demon said, and turning, he left with Frederick in tow. Anger, sadness, and frustration built inside of the sprite until it thought it was truly losing its mind. And again, the sprite wept until exhaustion took it. When the sprite woke, it again saw the smiling fox staring at it. But this time she was kneeling on the floor, resting her chin on the table next to the cage the sprite was in. "Hello again, little sprite," the laughing fox said cheerily. "Please let me out," the little sprite again pleaded. "Silly little sprite," the laughing fox said. "You know, all you have to do to get out of there is put the mask on. Then you will be free from this cage." "Free from the cage, maybe, but not the castle," the sprite said. "Why would you want to be free of such a wondrous place?" the laughing fox said. "The joy in this place is no more real than the smile on your mask," the sprite said. "Well, if you're not going to be civil, then I'm going to leave," the laughing fox said. The little sprite just glared at her as she turned and left. Sitting, the sprite picked up the mask. "Maybe this is the only way out of this cage," the sprite said to itself. "But I will not give up my freedom entirely just to increase the size of my cage." Slowly, the sprite began to probe the mask with its magic. The snarling demon had said he had never made a mask for a magical creature before, so perhaps there was some slight flaw that he had overlooked. A few hours later, the snarling demon returned with Frederick on his heels, but neither of them gave the sprite a second glance. Rummaging through his bookshelf, the snarling demon pulled out a dusty old tome and began to read. "Maybe if you gave me a rag and some water, I could clean myself up," the sprite said, trying to sound pleasant. "Not until you put on the mask," the snarling demon replied without looking up from the book. With deliberate slowness, the sprite began to lift the mask to its face, and the snarling demon turned to watch intently. As the mask neared the sprite's face, it could feel the magic reach out and take hold. All of the fear, pain, and weariness that it had felt began to melt away, leaving behind a blissful peace. The front of the mask that had been so plain before began to shape itself into a joyously laughing finch. Seeing this, the snarling demon brought over a washcloth, a bucket of water, and a new dress. He gently began washing the blood and dirt off of the sprite, and putting the new dress on it, he carried it down to the ballroom where the people were waiting. When the sprite and the snarling demon entered the ballroom, everyone gathered there stared up at them. Slowly, the sprite rose above the people's heads and began to twirl. Faster and faster it twirled, until its body started to blur, and a magical energy began to radiate from it. As the energy inside the sprite continued to build, it spun faster, until, with a deafening crack, the mask exploded off of the sprite's face as it focused all of the energy it had collected in its body into the mask. The sprite fled with all of its might towards the outer ring of the castle, out a window, and off into the forest. Once out in the forest, my dear sprite flew as far as its little wings would take it. Exhausted, the little sprite sat on a tree, and placing its hands on the trunk, it began reaching out with its mind to commune with the forest. But, to the sprite's horror, it found no magical energy whatsoever. This entire forest was dead, and it would never speak again. My dear sprite didn't know how long it had been in that castle, but now that it was outside, it could see that it was night. Floating above that strange dead forest, the sprite could see a line of light coming from the castle under the trees. Curious but cautious, the sprite flew closer, using the treetops to hide. As it got closer, it noticed that the light was coming from torches. It looked like all of the people in the party had come out to look for the sprite, led by the snarling demon and Frederick. Staying above the trees, the sprite floated back to the castle, and making sure to stay hidden, it checked the ballroom to make sure it was empty. Seeing that it was, the sprite made its way up to the room in the top of the central spire. Frantically, the sprite searched the room. Surely there must be some clue of how to get out of this place, the sprite thought. But so absorbed was it with its searching that it didn't notice someone else enter the room until it heard the trapdoor shut with a bang. "You're causing quite the uproar, little sprite," the laughing fox said, though as the sprite turned to look at her, it noticed that the fox mask was no longer laughing. Now it just looked sad and tired. "I'm sorry," the sprite said, "but I just want to leave. I know you probably won't help me, but at least, please, don't stop me." "How did you break the mask?" the sad fox said. "Why should I tell you that?" the sprite said. "So you can help your master make a new mask that will contain me." "Please," the sad fox said, pleading. "Please, you must tell me. How did you break the mask?" Realizing the sad fox wasn't asking for her master, but for herself, the little sprite sadly replied, "I don't think it will help you. I'm sorry. And even if it would, I just can't trust you." "How about this?" the sad fox said. "I'll tell you a story, and after that, I'm sure you'll trust me." "What kind of story?" the sprite asked. "A very old story," the sad fox said. Now, the sprite was very fond of stories, and it knew that old stories usually held old truths. "Okay," the sprite said, "you tell me your story, and then I'll decide if I trust you." That's the end of this chapter of Frazzeldow's Horribly Dreadful Tales. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and comment below. If you'd like just the written or audio versions of this story, you can find them at Wattpad and SoundCloud respectively. Links in the description below.